Hi everyone, welcome to another G News podcast. Today we are very fortunate to have Barbara Edmonds join us, and Barbara is Labour's spokesperson for finance, the economy, savings and investment. Hi Barbara, and welcome to the show.
Talofa lava, thanks for having me on.
You're very welcome. Let's start by talking about economic credibility and the blame game. We just keep seeing fiscal cruelty and neglect. We are sick and tired in the public, I think, of misleading rhetoric about blame, inflation, why it declined, who's responsible. On what planet does Nicola Willis have any remaining economic credibility?
If someone can name the planet, please let me know. It's quite incredible and also incredulous that the government takes all the credibility for inflation coming down, but then anywhere where the economic indicators are not doing so well, they blame everybody else. And what I've seen perhaps more so over this year and was sort of growing last year is more a public sentiment of, okay, you can blame Labour for all of this, whatever, that's politics. However, what's your plan? And more I'm starting to hear that more loudly as to the government said they're going to bring New Zealand back on track. I don't feel like I'm back on track. And we're seeing that with growing homelessness. The food banks are screaming out for more support. We're starting to see, families that hardship withdrawals from KiwiSaver. A lot of the economic indicators not supporting that narrative from the government.
Yeah, right from the get-go, it's been ferries, it's been cancer drugs, it's been, now it's butter being, was it 46% higher than it was, cheese, transport, and the unaffordable water that's driving up and behind rates increases. Families are reeling, aren't they? I mean, what are you hearing out there about the struggle that people are having in this cost of living crisis?
I have major concerns for our families, like really major concerns, and I see it through the doors coming through in Porirua, where my electorate office in Mana is. I'm hearing it from families that I'm meeting every day, that things are so tough, like the worst that they've seen it in their time. And so it's no surprise that you see over 47,000 New Zealanders leaving for Australia. If you're going to get better pay somewhere else, if you're going to get ahead, even the chance of possibly owning your first home, I see it in my own family. I remember that brain drain during John Key's time. A big raft of my family went to Australia to do better, and they are doing better. And I'm starting to see that same cyclical, movement again. But our families are doing it tough. And when you think about, inflation is sort of two parts, right? Inflation that's traded in, so tradable inflation, and then non-tradable inflation, so which is more domestic inflation. The areas where there is high inflation is food prices, energy, insurance premiums, and rates. Insurance premiums, rates, and energy are three areas which it's really difficult for monetary policy to address. So we're seeing that really tight circumstances are starting to flow through to everyday Kiwis. And I have huge concerns for just our families being able to afford to put food on the tables. I'm hearing our pensioners are struggling as well. And we've only just hit the middle of winter.
Yeah, it's shocking, isn't it? Really bad stories. Family Boost, this was supposed to help people with children. What happened? I mean, what we're seeing now is people are getting Family Boost who are earning over $200,000 a year. It's not exactly the squeezed middle anymore, is it? Or the people in need. What's the full story there? What actually happened?
So to get the full story, let's rewind back to the election. So a lot of people will remember the Prime Minister saying, you're going to get a $250 tax cut. Then you saw the language change to up to $250 tax cut. And then actually the language then changed to if you qualify for Family Boost as well. Family Boost, the figures have shown it's been an absolute failure for this government. And we've been questioning the government, okay, so how many people have actually received the full $250 tax cut that you promised during the election? They can't find one.
Wow.
So it's been big promises, big commitments that they gave during the election, that they watered down their language as time progressed. But actually, it's been a huge failure. The fact is that we've been saying this all along to the government. We've been saying, you need to make it easier. You need to make it easier for time poor parents to receive this. And what they've done instead is just increased it to families of $200,000. What about the rest of the families who haven't been able to access this? So we've been on their case about this, and it's just quite clear with the numbers that have come out recently. There's an absolute failure.
Wow. Now, pay equity. There's another big shocker that really, really upset huge numbers of people, particularly working women in low-income jobs. To me, this is like theft. What was done here? What was the process that was undertaken? What did you see happen around this pay equity grab? I think we'd call it a cut. What happened there?
Well, this year's budget was brought to you by working women, in particular low-paid working women who were subject to 33 claims that got cancelled effectively overnight by the government a week before budget. That's close to $13 billion that the government saved basically by cutting women's pay. They use that money to go towards other part of their budget, other initiatives within their budget. A lot of working women, and particularly those that had the claims, they were just outraged by this. We were outraged by this. We were on the steps of Parliament, at 12:30 when they had made the announcement earlier that day at 10:30. We joined a number of the unions who were working on these claims. We joined them on the forecourt of Parliament, and it was right there and then that Chippy, Chris Hipkins, made the commitment that we would reverse those changes. But ultimately, I come from a family of aged care support workers. My mum was one. I've got a number of aunties who are in that sector. I have an absolute personal commitment that, those pay equity changes, we will be reversing them. What we need to step through carefully, though, is making sure that those that have had to, for a second time, apply for a pay equity claim, that they don't have to apply for a third time when we reverse those changes. But it's absolutely appalling what the government did. And so this year's budget was brought to you by working women, and it's just an absolute poor reflection on what we value as New Zealanders.
Exactly. Super and superannuation. There's a lot of talk at the moment about this coming big crunch and how we can't afford it. But are the so-called sensible people correct? Because you've got Max Rashbrook saying, well, actually, if the Cohen Fund is all used properly, then the incremental projections out to 2060 only increase by about 0.9 of 1%. And on the other hand, we've got arguments out there that, we need to means test. We just need to jump to that. And we've also got this idea of raising the age of eligibility. What are your thoughts on what's the truth of the matter about the affordability of superannuation going forward?
Well, for me, it's quite superficial, some of the arguments that are currently in media at the moment, the discourse around, won't be able to afford super. When you look at super, you actually need to look at retirement in full. So the Retirement Commission has to do a review of our retirement settings every few years. I understand that they'll be having another review, will be released later this year. But if you look back to the 2022 review, they said, look, the Retirement Commissioner, Jane Wrightson, said, look, we know that there's lots of calls on making super means tested for raising the age, but actually the bigger conversation needs to be housing. Because of the way that New Zealand's market is set up, a lot of people bought houses because it was going to be their retirement fund, sell the house, downsize, smaller unit. Where is the conversation about whether we have sufficient housing given that home ownership rates in New Zealand are reducing? KiwiSaver, a huge pillar for our retirement settings here in New Zealand. Where is the conversation around having, a pathway around contribution increases, what the impact of that around total remuneration packages, How do we encourage people to enter into KiwiSaver? You know, cutting the government contribution in half, as we saw in this year's budget, definitely is not an incentive. But particularly, or as well, how do we encourage more people to take up KiwiSaver? Because we have over 90% of individuals in New Zealand who are actually signed up to KiwiSaver. But actually, where the concern is for those who are self-employed and sole traders. That's actually around the mid-60s. So how are we helping to address their retirement needs in the future? So I think there's a lot of conversation around means testing super, raising the age of super. There's clearly some economists who I do agree with that, thank goodness we had Sir Michael Cullen set up the New Zealand Super Fund. Imagine how big it would be if the national government hadn't stopped the contributions. But anyway, thank you, Labor, for re-indicting those contributions. But this is the way that Labor sees it. We just look at it as a scheme in total, not just the super part of it, the KiwiSaver, the housing issue, and then we think about, okay, what is it that Kiwis need when they go to retire? And if we've got less home ownership, what is the government doing to support with more social housing for our ageing population?
Great. Tax reform. Now, I know that we're not really ready to talk in detail about Labor's tax policies, but at a general level, when it comes to tax, it's a fairness issue for a lot of people out there, you know, that we've got a kind of an unfair imbalance in our tax system. And we're hearing different proposals from different parts of society. So one that came out the other day was from Robert McCulloch and Roger Douglas, and they talked about lowering corporate tax and channeling tax up to $60,000 into things like retirement and superannuation and other things. Then you've also got the Green Party with a fiscal strategy that talks about increasing some of our debt, I guess, and how perhaps the Treasury has been very conservative in its debt ceilings. I think they said we could have 23 Cyclone Gabriels and a couple of simultaneous COVIDs if we were to kind of like take those estimates seriously. So when it comes to fairness and just sort of redistributing things around tax, what are your general comments about where Labor's at?
If only we knew a tax lawyer, Jared. So ultimately, you're correct. There is an imbalance in our tax system. So the way that New Zealand's tax system is set up, it's based upon this principle called broad base, low rate. Have a really broad revenue base, so tax a whole lot of things so that you can keep the rate really low. And for a long time, that has basically been the measured principle in which New Zealand's tax system is operated. But it's really clear to both you and I that there is an imbalance in the system because actually there is some forms of capital which is being treated as income for individuals, which is not being captured. And so the most basic example I use every time is that why should a salary and wage earner be taxed every dollar that they earn, but somebody like Christopher Luxon, who could sell his third, fourth, fifth investment property, make a capital gain and it be totally tax-free? So there is a very clear balance because actually our broad base is not actually that broad. And we are one of 3 OECD countries, for example, that doesn't have a capital gains tax. The other, really strong commentary that I'm hearing coming through from different parties and commentators is around a wealth tax. And it was obviously something that David Parker, Grant Robertson were considering actively during, I think it was 2023. And so there has been some work done on that. What I'm finding really interesting, though, is that there's only 6 jurisdictions in the world that have a wealth tax, but a number of countries are now starting to actively talk about it. So we've seen the UK in the last week. There's been a little bit of commentary around whether the UK will bring in a wealth tax. I've also heard some commentary. It was Jim Chalmers, the Australian Treasurer, a couple of weeks ago had a really big speech about setting up a cabinet roundtable. And the media were really quizzing him quite hard about whether Australia will bring in a wealth tax. And again, it's the reason why Jim Chalmers has set up this roundtable is because we know there are revenue issues, or he knows there's revenue issues for Australia in the long term. So it's a conversation that Labor is more than happy to have. We will have announcements later this year as to the different options we think that we should bring more capital into the revenue tax base. But for us, there's a very clear imbalance. There's a very clear unfairness. And if you ask a salary and wage earner why they should be taxed every dollar, but someone can sell the third, fourth, fifth, sixth home and it be tax-free, I'm pretty clear their answer in response to that will be that it's unfair.
Let's talk about a better conversation about debt. Now, Chris Hipkins mentioned in a media exchange about a month ago that we do need to actually have a better conversation about debt. And I think he talked about, let's talk about the value of all of our assets as well as the debt. But we're also kind of hearing from Treasury this kind of debt ceiling amount. What research is there behind our understandings of the debt ceiling and where it's prudent to keep things below that level versus, I believe, the former Secretary of the Treasury made a remark at the Waikato University that suggested that there was some research that said New Zealand could recover from even a 90% of GDP debt level, but you know that's kind of the level at which we see the UK, for example. We could come back from those high levels. What research have you come across, and what do you think about that general area?
Again, a lot of the commentary I hear around debt, I believe, is quite superficial again, because debt is only one part of the government's balance sheet, right? We have assets as well. What's the revenue coming in? So to look at debt in isolation ignores the fact that even if you're a business, sometimes you borrow to build something or to create an asset, to buy an asset, to produce more things. So I've been, over the last sort of years, the last 6 months, I've been both in London and in the US for different types of meetings and events. And the fact that I can be a foreigner, I go to these countries, I can pull out my credit card and just pay and go on a subway that takes me wherever I need to go. That's actually really difficult to do here in Auckland. It's difficult to do in some of our cities because we don't have a good public transport system. Why can't we have nice things in New Zealand? Like, seriously, why can't we have nice things? And it takes actually real clear a vision and a purpose for New Zealand and a long-term thinking about actually if there needs to be debt to pay for capital items, and that we partner, whether it's with the private sector, whether it's with iwi, whether it's with public sector funds, which are in ACC, superannuation, KiwiSaver funds. Why aren't we having that conversation? The conversation should be, what is it that New Zealand needs to be able to enable productivity, to enable people to be able to get their kids to school on time, to be able to have our tourists come here and be able to enjoy our full country and be able to get around the city quickly. The conversation, that's the sort of conversation we should be having, is what is the New Zealand that we want? And then figuring out how the steps that we need to go through to get to that. Debt will be part of that conversation, but so will be how do we use our balance sheet, our assets that we already hold in New Zealand, how do we use them better in order for us to have the nice things which really our children and our future generations in New Zealand deserve. Because we will all pay that off. And the benefits to our country will be long-term as opposed to these short-term cycles where things start and stop and we lose 17,000 construction sector roles who then move off to Australia. And then finally, when the government decides to have their infrastructure pipeline pipe up, well, where's the capacity to build it? So for me, it's about having those more structural conversations that we need to have, not just about looking at the small part of debt.
Great. You mentioned travelling overseas, and you've just recently returned from a trip overseas. Can you tell our audience a little bit about what you saw and what happened over there in that experience?
Yes, I've just recently come back from the US, both in New York, so having some meetings at the UN, meeting with our permanent ambassador in the UN, and also went down to Washington DC and spent a few days there. I was part of a speakers delegation, which was headed by the speaker, Jerry Brownlee. Really interesting time, both with the UN. The UN is actually going under a review. They've lost about a fifth of their funding, with countries pulling back on the amount or not increasing the amount for inflation that the UN receives. So there's a real a review around what should the UN be focusing on and where do they put their resources. That in some ways, I understand, New Zealand does welcome that because we've been calling for a review for a long time. But I think it's really clear that there is a real fundamental first principles discussion happening at the UN about actually how effective are we, and actually if we're not being effective, because in some respects, one part of the UN can veto the work of many nations, what's their outcome going to be? So I think that's something that we should watch quite carefully. In relation to the Washington DC part of the trip, some really interesting commentary around the politics that's happening around the Senate, Congress. Obviously, President Trump just managed to pass his big, beautiful bill on the 4th of July. We landed in New York on the 6th of July, so just afterwards. Really interesting to see what the flow-on effects of that bill are to the rest of the US domestic market. So, for example, I think 70 to 80% of Americans depend on that Medicare. Well, that big, beautiful bill, removed that. So we're going to see, you might not see the effect straight away, but you might see it in the months to come as Americans realise, oh, this Medicare is no longer here for me to access. The second element of that trip is I spent a bit of time with the World Bank and the IMF. Really good to have those discussions with economists to see what they're seeing across the world. I had a particular focus on our Pan-Pacific and Southeast Asia area. It's really clear the most certain thing is uncertainty. So for us here in New Zealand, I think it's really, for me, being little old me here in Porirua and Wellington, it's really important that as Labour comes out with our economic plan, that we're staying in tune with what's happening globally. For me as well, it reaffirmed my views that actually what we need to do in New Zealand is actually strengthen our Pacific and our Southeast Asia relationships, that CTPP and how that carries out. Because ultimately, when COVID hit, we saw supply chains get really rocked, and then we saw huge inflation across the globe. If for any reason something happens overseas and effectively supply chains get hit again, where is New Zealand's vulnerability? And how do we work with countries like Australia, like our Pacific family, which we will be responsible for assisting, as well as Southeast Asia? How are we strengthening those chains? Where are our weaknesses? How do we strengthen those relationships, and how do we prepare just in case? So a really great trip to solidify some of my thinking in that space.
Awesome. Now, I have a question about Nicola Willis and what I think could potentially be performance art. We're hearing a lot of public conversations from Nicola Willis about how she's going to go and talk to her old friends at Fonterra about why the price of butter is so high in New Zealand compared to the same butter in Australia. What do you make about the efficacy of having these chats and the likelihood that it'll make any difference?
I'm surprised she doesn't know, given she worked for Fonterra, that she doesn't understand it already. I've actually managed to, over the last year, develop a relationship with Fonterra, and I spent an hour with their economic forecast team. So, because my curiosity was around, how do you forecast your milk gate prices? Because if, as a future Minister of Finance, I want to know what the red flags are to know when, for example, commodities is our main export in New Zealand, a big part of our GDP. So what are the things that would rock that? And ultimately it comes down to some of the global demands. So we've got high milk prices, strong global demand for New Zealand milk products. So obviously that filters down to the domestic market. Plus we have trade. We have trade clauses as to why we can't provide a subsidy within New Zealand compared to, because that puts us out of step with the competition, from offshore. So really surprised that the Minister of Finance didn't know this. She lauds a lot that she worked for Fonterra. Would have thought she would have spent time with their economics team or their forecasting team. I also have Fonterra catching up with them next week, and so it'll be interesting to see what those conversations were like. But ultimately, it comes down to these prices will fluctuate per supply and demand if you take that really simple economic equation there. However, the problem is that what the government has taken away from people is more than what they're receiving from the government. So maybe blocks of butter will be more affordable for families if they had more money in their hands. But by, taking away 3 waters and then taking 18 months to come up with their water plan, which meant that local councils had to double-digit rate increases, not dealing with the energy market, and basically, what's happened with energy prices. And then, things like the National Resilience Plan, which was $6 billion fund that Labor had put aside we were in government, which regional councils could apply for, local authorities could apply for to basically strengthen some of their climate resilience because climate change is happening, floods are happening. These sort of things means that rather than the government taking on the cost of the increase in the cost of living, what they've done is effectively pushed the cost back onto the consumer, pushed it back onto everyday New Zealanders. But by the way, you got a $250 tax cut, so be grateful for that.
Wow.
I'm being sarcastic there.
Exactly. Now, supermarkets and the supermarket duopoly, there's a bit of talk about taking a stick to them, breaking them up, what have you. What do you make of the likelihood that anything is going to really shift in that area under the current settings?
I'm seeing the same pattern with the government. Big talk, minimal action. Same with Family Boost. Big talk about it's going to deliver for 21,000 families, $975, but actually, less than 160 families receive that full amount. Ultimately, again, it may be just me, the way I operate is you got to dig a bit deeper and you got to look at what are the levers, where is the competition issues that we are having. We've got some good work that's happened, that's come out through the grocery review with the Commerce Commission, with the Grocery Commissioner. There's a lot of work that's happening out there. But ultimately, I look at it as well as a mother. We live in Porirua, and Porirua has the third highest median income in the country, which people find surprising, but also deep pockets of deprivation. When I look at it as a mother coming through in Porirua, we have good competition in Porirua. We've got all the major supermarket brands. We've got local butchers. We've got a couple of local fishmongers and greengrocers. So I had this sort of conversation, thinking, okay, is competition not necessarily a third big supermarket player, but actually how do we support the wholesale market? What are the levers in the wholesale market to ensure that those smaller greengrocers, butchers, fishmongers, how do we help them to be competitive against the bigger players? So I think a lot of the superficial banging a stick, I'm going to force them to break up. That's not the way I operate. The way I operate is look deeper, figure out where are the sticking points for it, and it's quite clear competition law. And for me, the wholesale is the key areas which we should be looking at, again, to support some of our smaller businesses who are offering this in some areas to be able to expand even further.
Great. The Reserve Bank of New Zealand, independent from government, and the involvement, I suppose, of the finance minister around the edges here, we've seen that kind of being questioned a bit in recent Finance and Expenditure Committee meetings. And we're also seeing this long-term debacle, I suppose, over the lowering of bank capital limits and the sudden changes that have occurred in remarkable timings. Could you comment a bit about some of the background there and what you think you're seeing?
It's no coincidence. It's no coincidence that the Minister of Finance's office requested an urgent meeting with the Reserve Bank Governor, the previous Reserve Bank Governor. I think they had sent like 3 or 4 requests for the Governor before the Governor went back to the Minister of Finance's office and said, we can't speak right now. It's the blackout. We have a blackout by convention that we don't, so we're not influenced around an OCR hearing. And then when the Minister of Finance gets that meeting with the Reserve Bank Governor, that he resigns pretty quickly afterwards. And that at that meeting, what was discussed was the capital requirements review and the funding of the Reserve Bank. So it doesn't take much to add up the pieces. We've asked questions of the minister. She, in select committee quite recently in the budget estimates, she says that it's the decision for the Reserve Bank Governor. Yeah, but sometimes when people are cornered and they can't deliver what they need to deliver, despite things, despite the requests from their higher masters, it doesn't take much to add that all up, and it's not a coincidence.
Right. How would you summarise the state of the New Zealand economy at the moment, and how will Labor go about improving the state of the economy, which Bernard Hickey has described as a bit of a housing market with some other bits tacked on? Mm. How would you describe it, and where are we at, and where could we go?
So the economy is not necessarily a person, it's obviously a system of things, and it has different parts to it. So when you speak to families, they are finding it incredibly tough. When you look at economic indicators, it's quite clear that the economy is going backwards. So recent Business New Zealand data shows that for manufacturing and services, that's actually gone backwards as well. You look at the Reserve Bank and the Treasury and the IMF, who are forecasting when growth is finally going to, when is New Zealand going to grow? And there will always be some differences. But actually how people are feeling it, and this is not just the families I speak to, but also the businesses, they just feel like it's not going anywhere. And that's a really hard thing when you're when you're wanting to be the finance minister. That's a really big problem that you have to deal with. And for me and for Labor, budgets are all about choices. There's another budget to come, and there's 2 budgets that we've just been through. The government's decisions to pull a handbrake on social housing builds, school builds, hospital builds, and then to pause while they think about what roads they're going to build or announce and then eventually build, and public transport projects. Yes, that's infrastructure and it's a particular sector, but when you put a handbrake on a really key sector like that, you're actually taking away billions of dollars of money from the economy. And so effectively what we're seeing with government investment, which has basically been paused and there's lots of cuts, when an economy is slowing down like this and you see the private sector pull back, usually the government comes in and stimulates it. And that's to keep people in jobs, keep people in homes, to keep people going to their local supermarket and buying the things that they can afford. But ultimately for Labor, we wouldn't pull back in the way that the government has done over the last 18 months because we've seen the effect of that. We've seen big projects cancelled and paused. We've seen a huge loss in the construction sector workers, that workforce. That all has a flow-on effect. And then what they've done again with pay equity, can you imagine if $11 billion had gone to the pay packets of low-paid working women and low-paid workers? What do the textbooks tell us? They go and spend it in the economy. So there's a lot of inaction that's happened by this government, which is currently not recorded or measured. But ultimately for Labor, we know we have these big problems we have to deal with. And right now, it's about making sure that we have a plan for really smart government investment.
Barbara, thank you very much for talking to us today. It's been really interesting and informing and focusing, actually, for all of us out there who have had a guts full of all of the blame game rhetoric and bad outcomes that have continued on. This stuff was supposed to be fixed, but it hasn't been fixed. It's just been made worse, in my opinion.
Exactly. You look at the pre-election fiscal update, when we left government, inflation was meant to be down right now, and we were meant to be growing. Yeah, it's just not the same.
It's not, is it? You'll be welcome back again to talk to us again as we go, and really appreciate your time spent with us today. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Welcome to G News, the good news.
Yeah, right.